the night. So I'll tell you what, why don't we just start in Luke 21 and we'll just kind of morph into this as we go through, because this is kind of where I was going. The first thing I want to point out, just because this keeps popping up, so I want to formally make sure that we understand this. But Luke 21 is a short parallel when you talk about Matthew 24 and 25. And remember that I've talked about this before, but I wish Matthew chapter 25 wasn't a chapter. Because in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, the disciples said to Christ, we might as well just go there. Okay, I said Luke 21. I'm reneging. Let's go to Matthew 24. In Matthew 24, verse 3 says, and as he, Christ, was sitting on the Mount of Olives. Now, gosh, see, if I'd really thought this through, then what I would have done is I'd have had a picture of Jerusalem stuff. But if you look at Jerusalem from the south, you're looking at Mount Zion. So if you can picture a mountain that you're looking at, and it's not much of a mountain by our standards, we would never have called it Mount Zion. We would have called it like Hill Zion or something like that. It's certainly not what you and I, at least me coming from Western North Carolina, it's nothing like I would call a mountain. It's like a hill. And so, but because there's no other really super big hills around that area, it ends up being pretty prominent. So you're looking to Jerusalem from the south, and there's this kind of hill thing, and that's where the Jebusite city was, and it's got a valley to the west and a valley to the east. So if you're looking from the south, then you're looking at Hill of Zion, and then the valley that breaks down to your right side as you're looking from the south is the Kidron Valley. Down across the bottom of the Kidron Valley is where the Garden of Gethsemane is, and then you start to go up the slopes of the Mount of Olives. So the top of the Mount of Olives, which is just simply a larger hill. So the top of the Hill of Olives is probably 300 feet, something like that, higher than Mount Zion. So what that means is that when he's sitting on the Mount of Olives, then he can look down over Jerusalem. Oh, and I wanted to start in verse 1, and I forgot. So it says, as Jesus was going out of the temple and going away, and his disciples came to him to show him all the buildings of the temple. Now, this is really important because I'm not exactly sure where this is coming from. I suspect it's anti-Jewish money and perhaps some Muslim money, but there are a number of YouTubes out now on the internet saying that the Temple Mount area, you know what? Let me just see what I can do about bringing this up on my screen here. Let's see what I've got. Yeah, okay. So to do this thing here, what I want to do is do this nifty share screen guy. So that would be under share. I think share. Yeah. Try that and try share. At this point, you guys should be looking at the city of Jerusalem with my cursor over it. Is that?
Yes, we see it.
Okay. So we are standing on top of the Mount of Olives, and we are looking to the west. From this is the Mount of Olives to the east, and here is the west. If you are looking at Jerusalem, this area here is the city of David. Then there was a little dip called Millo, which David and Solomon filled in. And then you have the temple area. This is the 37-acre enclosure built by Herod the Great. Solomon's temple would have been much smaller, but would have been in this general vicinity as well. This 37-acre facility is the Temple Mount. There are more YouTubes and more discussion now about this not being the Temple Mount, but being the Roman camp. and they're saying the temple was down here. Now, the Muslims control this 37-acre called Haram esh-Sharif, and and there's interest in trying to dissuade the Jews from wanting this area and having a temple there. Now, thankfully, they're not going to win. We know by Revelation 11, they're going to have a temple here. But the fact of the matter is right now, there's a lot of talk, oh, the temple wasn't really here. This was the headquarters of the Roman legion. Well, there's some huge problems with that. The first is that when Herod built, now this is Herod's Western Palace in Jerusalem, and Herod built all over the Holy Land. He built Masada, he built Herodian, he built his Western Palace, he built this area here, he built a gigantic tomb, a huge place, not quite as big as this, but a gigantic building over the tomb of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He fortified Caesarea and built its harbor. He fortified Jericho and had a fortified palace there. Herod, in fact, Herod is known by historians as Herod the Great Builder, because that's what he was. He built everywhere. And because he built everywhere, he used a very distinctive type of building style. And this temple has that distinctive type of building style. And people say, well, but it's the headquarters of the Roman legion. Herod didn't have a Roman legion. There was no Roman legion there until, in fact, there wasn't even a full Roman legion there when the Roman governor took over, because the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and the other Roman governors didn't have their headquarters in Jerusalem. They had their headquarters in where? Caesarea, on the coast. And then why would they come up to Jerusalem? They would come up to Jerusalem to keep order during the feasts. So 3 times a year, and I'm sure the Roman governors thought it was a big pain in the butt, but 3 times a year the Roman governors would make the journey from Caesarea to Jerusalem so that they could watch over the feasts and keep order, because so many people poured into Jerusalem. So there's this rumor that this was not the temple of Herod, but we know that it actually was the temple of Herod. There's a whole bunch of archaeological evidence to support that. There's the stonework itself. There's the fact that a Roman legion didn't exist in Jerusalem at any time, and especially not when Herod was king and doing his building. The south steps of the Temple Mount, which have only been uncovered in the last about 35 years, are steps that were built by Herod and designed by the priests. They were not the kind of steps that the Romans would have. Also, if you notice this little building here is the Hasmonean Palace, because when the Hasmoneans kicked the Greeks out of Israel, they built a palace here in the center of Jerusalem. And when Herod moved in and took over Jerusalem as king, he didn't have a palace yet. He had not had time to build his Western Palace, so he took over the Hasmonean Palace. Now, why is that important? Because Herod was paranoid. I mean, we're talking about a guy that had his wife executed because the people loved her more than they loved him. Then he had one of his sons drowned in the family swimming pool because he was afraid that his son was going to try to take over. Then he had a second one of his sons executed because he thought that other son had designs on being king. Herod was monstrously paranoid. That's why as soon as he heard there was going to be a potential new king born in Bethlehem, he killed all of the children 3 years and under in the entire vicinity. I mean, he was that paranoid and that cruel. So Herod was constantly afraid that the people in the temple, the priests and the Levites, were scheming. So here he is across the way in the Hasmonean Palace. So what does he do? He builds a big old tall tower so he can spy down on the priests. This pissed the priests off considerably, and Josephus wrote about how then the priests built up this western wall here so Herod couldn't peek in. And of course, then Herod built up, and then the priests built up, and Herod built up, and they got into this little building contest, and the priests finally won, and Herod couldn't spy down. But there's no way that Herod from here could look into a temple that was down here. He just simply looked across the Tyropian Valley, which is the valley that starts here, runs up through here, runs up between the temple and the upper city, and then kind of dissipates up here. So this is so what Herod did when this is an uphill slope. This whole thing is going uphill from your left to your right. And so the problem then is you would have the temple, Herod's temple, on a slope. So what Herod did is he built this huge wall. He built this huge wall, and he built this huge wall on the far side that they aren't part of the temple. They are the foundation stone to hold in dirt. And the stones are huge. The largest, they're cut out of their limestone. The largest stone in the wall over on this western side is 15 feet square and 46 feet long, and its estimated weight is 415 tons. And archaeologists are still arguing about how in the world he got it into the wall, and they have some ideas, but they're not really sure. But anyway, this is Herod's work. It's certainly not anything that Pontius Pilate or any of the Roman governors could have done. Now, this becomes important when we go back to the text of Scripture. I'm going to stop sharing here. Let's see. So when we go back to the text of Scripture, notice that they're coming out of the temple and going away. In Matthew 24:1, his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. This does not include the foundation wall. The foundation wall was not a building of the temple. Now, why does that become important? Verse 2, but he answered and said to him, you see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, in no way will even one stone be left here on another that will not be thrown down. And people have come to me and said, yeah, but John, look at these huge stones and these huge walls. They're obviously still standing. That is correct. And they were not part of the buildings of the temple, and the buildings of the temple were thrown down, but the foundation wasn't. As it's turned out, it's been a real boon for people like you and I that the top of the Temple Mount was pushed over down onto the city below, because it covered up the city below, and it's only been in the last 20 to 30 years that city's been uncovered. So now we can walk up the steps that Jesus walked up. We can walk on the road that Jesus walked on, and we do that when we're over there. So he says these things are going to be thrown down. Then verse 3, then what's he do? He goes across the Kidron Valley to the east, goes up on top of the Mount of Olives, and then the whole city of Jerusalem is laid out in front of him to the west. So he's on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And that question, when will these things be, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age, take Matthew chapter 24 and 25 to answer that question. And it gets lost because of the break in Matthew 25. People, they don't keep reading and realize that Christ doesn't end the answer to his question till the end of Matthew 25. So in Matthew, you've got this huge, almost 2-chapter answer to what Christ to Christ's question. Now, if we go back to Luke 21, in Luke 21, what took 2 chapters in Matthew is this kind of little minuscule explanation. But the fact is, for where you and I stand, it's really power-packed because it contains a fair amount of information that Matthew doesn't contain. But Matthew, is the more dominant chapter, so that's usually where people go. It's usually where I go. So verse 5 says, and as some spoke of the temple, and we know from Matthew 24, the some is the disciples that came to him privately. And they spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts. Christ said, as for these things that you see, the days will come in which there will not be left one stone on another that won't be thrown down. And again, it's even more clear in Luke than it is in Matthew that we're not talking about the foundation of the Temple Mount that holds the dirt in and makes the place level. We're talking about the buildings and the offerings and the things that are on top of the Temple Mount that decorated it. And sure enough, they've all been thrown down. So verse 7, and they asked him, saying, Teacher, so when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are about to come to pass? Now remember, at this time in his life, Christ didn't know the sacred secret. What he did know was the Old Testament. And the Old Testament had a number of places that indicated quite clearly that when the Messiah came, that he would both suffer but conquer in the same package. If you remember, I think it's Isaiah 65, the Spirit of the Lord, or maybe is it Isaiah 65, that he's come to preach the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God. And it's right there in one single verse. Or you look at Daniel chapter 9, and he says, 77s are determined against your people, which is 490 years. And then he lays out the 490 years are going to be broken up into 62 weeks and 7 weeks and 1 week. But he doesn't tell the people that between because I don't think he knew, between the end of the 7 weeks and the 1 week, which we know is the 7 years of the tribulation, there's going to be a 2,000-year hiatus called the Age of Grace. So based on the prophecies of the Old Testament, what was Christ expecting? He was expecting the end to come right then. In fact, and he said that very clearly in a number of places. In Matthew chapter 16, he said, there's some of you standing here that won't die until you see the kingdom come in power. And of course, they're all dead. He looked at the scribes and Pharisees and they said, are you the Christ? And he says, I am. And you will see the Son of Man coming on the right hand of power. And he really thought they would see it, that they would be alive. He was asked that at his trial. He was tried that night. He was dead in a couple days. And he thought that was going to be the end. And he's going to get up from the dead. He's going to ascend into heaven, see his heavenly Father, come back with a band of angels and kick tail. And he said, you will see the Son of Man come. And he really expected that. And so this becomes very important to you and I in light of what he taught these people, because he taught these people in light of the coming tribulation. And you and I think there's a very good chance that we are the generation that is leading up to the tribulation. And so what Christ said here for them becomes very relevant to us. So he says, verse 8, take heed that you're not led astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he. The time is drawn near. Don't follow after them. And basically what this is saying is there's going to be a lot of people that will come and try to lead people astray. And he says, whenever you hear about wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must come to pass first, but the end is not immediately. So there wars and insurrections, and there will be, in verse 10, then he said to them, group will rise against group and kingdom against kingdom. And the word group here, and I've taught this before out of Matthew, is ethnos in the Greek. We get our English word ethnic from it, but it doesn't mean in Greek what it means in English. Ethnic in English is more like whether you're Caucasian or whether you're Hispanic or whether you're African American or whether you're American Indian or whether you're Middle Eastern or Asian or whatever, and that's kind of ethnic. In the Greek way of thinking about ethnic, if you were of the same culture or if you were of the same family, or if you were of the same, there were a whole bunch of things that made you ethnic. You could be Hispanic or African American or Caucasian. That was one aspect of it. But you could also be a Methodist and not a Baptist. And you could have a war between the Methodists and the Baptists. You could have the Crips versus the Bloods. You could have the neo-Nazis versus the whoever they don't like. I don't even know. I just know they don't like people. You could, and so really in translating ethnos versus ethnos, we did a lot of study on how to translate this, and basically it came down to a group against group. And here we are, we're in Little Bloomington, Indiana, and we've had a farmer's market here that's been the gem of Indiana for everybody. I mean, every community in Indiana realizes that the farmer's market in Bloomington, Indiana is the best in the state. It's friendly, it's colorful, there's a lot of Amish around, and they're really aggressive about growing this fantastic stuff, these vegetables that are, I try and grow vegetables, and it's like, you got to be kidding me. I'm glad I don't have to live on what I grow for even a week. But our farmers market is so fabulous. And so what happens last month? Some neo-Nazis move in and take over a booth, and they're preaching hatred against everybody and killing everybody, and they're ruining the whole. They had to shut down the farmers market for 2 weeks just to figure out what to do. And it's like, really? I mean, I thought we kind of got rid of that in World War II. Where is this coming from? And beyond that, where's this hatred coming from? Somebody looks a little different than I do. Somebody talks a little different than I do. Somebody has different ideas about, how to live or what to eat, or, and you want to kill them and you want to preach hate again. It's like, that's just so weird. I mean, honestly, it's so weird. And yet it's absolutely what the Bible says. The Bible says there's going to be group against group, and that's as simple as it is. And you and I can expect it. It is coming. It's already here in part. We are not going to be able to stop it. You can't break the word of God. God is warning us, and we're not going to be able to do anything about it. And it says, group will rise against group, kingdom against kingdom, and we're going to see that too. Today we call them nations, but we're going to see the nations fighting each other. And there will be great earthquakes, and in various places, famines and plagues, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. Yeah, my gosh, have you guys been checking out the hail that's been falling around the world? Holy catfish, we just saw on the news tonight. Where was the hail falling? It was somewhere in the United States the size of baseballs. It's crazy. And there was one I saw 2 weeks ago. I forget where it was on the planet. It was like the size of small cantaloupes. And they said, if this thing hits you, it will kill you. And I'm like, great, nothing like a deadly hailstorm. But it's happening. It's not in the mainstream news for the most part. I was blown away tonight. This thing was in the mainstream news. But we can expect that. And one of the places that I get my news on what is happening geophysically around the world, what I've noticed is that different Christian ministries focus on different aspects of what's going on around the world. And there's two guys out of New Zealand that call themselves the Two Preachers. And if you do YouTube, you can go to YouTube and you can search for the Two Preachers. And they support orphanages and stuff like that, but they've developed quite a following, and people send them video clips from all over the world about things that are going on: earthquakes, floods, famines, sinkholes, forest fires. They've got now one of the largest, I think, you guys could check me out on this, but I think it's the largest forest fire that has ever been recorded burning in Alaska. Not the largest forest fire on Earth, but the largest forest fire that's ever burned in Alaska is burning in Alaska right now. It's like, really, Alaska has got a forest fire? And yet, and that didn't make front page news, or like second page news, or section B or C or something in the newspaper. And yet, no, not a word about it. But it's the type of thing that the scripture says. So there'll be famines, plagues, terrors, great signs from heaven, that just the stuff that's going on. And then verse 12, but before all these things, they'll lay their hand on you, persecute you, deliver you up to synagogues, bring you before governors and stuff, for my name's sake. But look what he says in verse 13. It will turn out as an opportunity for you to provide a testimony. And I think this is where we've got to have our attitudes proper. So when the dark gets darker, the light shines brighter. And as the world becomes more unpredictable and as things become darker, you and I have to be better prepared and more aggressive in our witnessing. Because take, for example, what just happened. You're likely to go to work tomorrow, go on a lunch break and meet somebody who says, gosh, isn't it terrible about these shootings? And you can completely, absolutely, this is horrible beyond belief, but not unexpected. What do you mean it's not unexpected? Well, the Bible says it's going to happen, and it says there's going to be worse. It does? And we can begin to have an impact on people, to point them to scripture. And, I love, Gary Tyson has a phrase that he uses all the time about, a lot of times he rescues me with it because I tend to go down the rabbit hole and it's like, oh, things are terrible. Oh, and Gary will look and he's so lighthearted about it. He goes, it's all good. It's all good. And I'm like, it just torques away. I'm like, it's all good. But then you think about it and it's like, we can utilize it. It's not unexpected, and we can utilize it to help people wake up to the world that's going on around him. And so he says, verse 13, it will turn out as an opportunity for you to provide a testimony. Verse 14, therefore settle it in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on how to answer. Now that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be prepared with some general things and general directions that God is moving. But he just in verse 15 says, but I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your opponents will not be able to withstand or deny. And I think this is really powerful because, and you and I know this, we don't know what's going on in the heart of a person. We don't know what they've experienced in life. And there can be a common situation like a shooting, and then and you think, okay, I'm going to prepare that if a shooting comes up, I'm going to say exactly this. And yet, because then you run into this person and you don't know what's happened in their heart and you don't know what they need. And maybe they bring something up about the shooting and you wouldn't mention a word about the shooting. You just kind of say, everybody's going to die. Are you prepared to death? Are you going to live forever or die forever? Huh? We don't know what's the best thing to say. We can have some general ideas so God can energize our memory. You know what I mean by that? If we have some general ideas, God can energize our memory. But just to walk into the situation with this kind of open heart, open head to God, and this person speaks in the environment, and you're sitting there and saying, okay, God, this is your game. You know the heart of every person. What comes out of my mouth that is going to go right into their core and make a difference? And the Lord can lead us in that. And he should be. And we should be praying for that and putting ourselves in situations where we can talk. And then he says, verse 16, just so we're not surprised about this. You'll even be handed over by your parents and brothers and relatives and friends. And it's really true. Some of the people that I would never have expected in my life based on, my growing up with certain people for years and years and years. If you'd have come to me, say 3-4 years ago and said, they're going to become an absolute raging liberal, and, I would say, no, not them. And then it's like, you're kidding. And I don't know what shifted in their heart, but people have really changed. And so basically when it says, you can be handed over by parents, brothers, relatives, friends, we just aren't so taken up by surprise that we become ineffective. And what's going to happen? Some of you they will cause to put to death. You'll be hated by everyone for my name's sake, and yet a hair of your head will never perish. He just said they could put you to death. What do you mean not a hair of your head will ever perish? And that's the difference between death and perishing. They may kill you, but they can't make you perish, because we have everlasting life. And I mean, you could see how Christ, the people listening to Christ this here on the Mount of Olives, Christ's disciples must have really understood that, because he just told them they're going to put some of you to death. And then he says right after that, but don't worry about it, you're not going to perish. And of course, he was the quintessential example of that, because it wasn't but less than a week after he said this on the top of the Mount of Olives that he himself was put to death. But did he perish? And the answer is no, not at all, because God got him up from the dead. And he says, verse 19, by endurance, you will gain your lives. And then he goes on to what's going to happen. And we've covered some of this out of Zechariah. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that her desolation is drawn near. We're going to be raptured by that time. And he goes on, if you're in Judea, flee to the mountains and that kind of thing. Because those, and this is interesting, verse 22, because those are the days of vengeance to fulfill all that's written. And that goes back to Isaiah 65, the days of vengeance of our God. And woe to people that are having, in a disadvantaged situation. They're nursing, or they have small babies or whatever. There will be great distress upon the land and wrath against the Jews. And this wrath against the Jews, I mean, even in Germany, for Pete's sake, Germany for so long has been protective of the Jews because of what Hitler did in World War II. And now, who was the big shot in the German government that came out that the Jews are being so persecuted by the resurrection of the neo-Nazis in Germany that and one of you guys may know this, and if you do, speak up, but I don't remember the name of the person in the German government who said that he could not guarantee the safety of a Jew who wore a yarmulke in Germany. If you wear a yarmulke in Germany, everybody knows you're a Jew. He said, if you're a Jew in Germany and you wear a yarmulke, we cannot guarantee your safety. If any of you know the name of who that was that said that. But that's how bad things are in Germany right now. It's crazy. But that's exactly, that is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. That's the start of the fulfillment. Verse 24, they'll fall by the edge of the sword.
Hey, John?
Yeah.
I just Googled it, and it looks like it was Felix Klein.
Okay.
On May 28th. Who said that?
Yeah. Great. May 28th. Yeah, I knew it wasn't very long ago. And who's Felix Klein? Do we know what position does he hold in Germany?
Just says a German official.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, but guys, is that crazy or what? I mean, everybody knew what Hitler in his Brown Party did to the Jews, and everybody's been very protective of the Jews, and all of a sudden, just out of nowhere, here's this hatred. And what are the Jews doing in Germany that's so bad? Not a thing. Yet it's a spiritually generated hatred. It's foretold in the Bible, and here it is.
It's all those Muslim immigrants.
Muslim immigrants?
Yeah, they stormed from Syria. They came into Germany. Remember a year ago, 1 million of them?
Yeah,
They hate Jews.
That's true. There's definitely those. Yep. And we have a growing number of that in the United States as well. And then, you get down to verse 25, signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and on earth distress among the nations. This thing about signs in the sun, moon, and stars, for really, I guess, ever since the apple supposedly fell on Isaac Newton's head, which we know didn't actually happen, the scientific world has been captivated by the gravitational theory of the universe. And so if you took, earth science back in high school, or if you studied, earth things, earth and space things in college, then you know, for example, there's the Big Bang, and after the Big Bang, there's a big spread of matter, and then that matter pulls together through gravitational attraction into stars and galaxies and hoopla and hoopla. And the problem with that is really coming to light is that gravitation doesn't have that much strength, that there's not enough strength in gravitation to pull that off. And so they're looking for another theory of the universe, and the theory that is starting, it's still very small and getting a lot of flack, but the theory that is making the most sense is the electromagnetic theory of the universe. Now, the understanding of the electromagnetic theory of the universe is making a whole lot more sense, but it's also allowing us to see things that we've never seen before. So, for example, if another YouTube that I follow is called Suspicious Observers, and they have a 5 to 7 minute broadcast every single morning, and it's pretty highbrow. I had to watch it for a number of months before I really figured out what was going on, and you have to read some of their stuff. But they're into the electromagnetic theory of the universe, and they're applying that. And what's happening is all of a sudden things that never made any sense before, like why are there earthquakes and volcanoes, and why are they where they are? Well, what is coming up is, the sun is a gigantic magnet. Yes, it has a gravity force, sure, but it's a gigantic magnet as well, and it produces a tremendous amount of electromagnetic energy, which you and I see on a fairly regular basis, particularly if you live in the northern hemisphere, like close to Minnesota, Alaska, those places. You see it as the aurora borealis. What's the aurora borealis? The aurora borealis is a whole piling of electrons from the sun into our atmosphere. Well, those electrons are coming day and night constantly. Well, interestingly enough, if there is a sunspot, or what they call a coronal hole, this is a hole in the surface of the sun, which allows more magnetic pull to come directly from the sun to the earth. So in other words, if you're looking at an even sun with no sunspots, we're getting a very limited magnetic pull. As soon as a big, huge sunspot comes rolling around in front, if that sunspot's pointing to the earth, it's like the sun just gets a big, huge magnet and points it right to the earth. Well, what's the core of the earth made of? Iron. And so the sun then, the number of sunspots and the position of the sunspots and the timing of the sunspots affects our Earth. And because they're now finally looking at this, nobody's ever looked at this before. All of a sudden people are looking at this and going, wait a minute, we're noticing a phenomenal correlation between sunspots and the earthquakes on our Earth, where they are, how strong they are, when they occur, to the point that if you go to the website earthquake, or it's called quakewatch.net, and their earthquake prediction accuracy now is up over 80%. And this is brand new. They haven't been able to do this before. And so all of a sudden, here's this thing that says there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. So now all of a sudden, we're correlating things that are happening on the sun to what's happening on Earth, where before we would have never seen that as a sign. And all of a sudden, we're correlating, wow, this is happening on the sun. It's directly affecting the Earth. It has nothing to do with global warming or, us building a campfire down here. It has everything to do with the fact that there's a giant hole in the sun, a coronal hole. And the world is getting blasted with a magnetic whap. And, they had one, 2-3 years ago, and the telephone lines in Oregon caught on fire. It had nothing to do with anything you and I were doing here on Earth. It was a magnetic hit from the sun. Did that make the front page news? No. Did it make the back page news? No, it didn't make any news at all. but it's the kind of thing that's happening. And finally, there are people that are paying attention. And as they're paying attention, then there is exactly what this verse says. There are signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and then that we never saw before. And of course, on earth, distress among the nations. And then it says, which will be perplexed and anxious because of the roaring of the seas and the waves. I was like, the roaring of the seas and the waves. And another guy that I watch periodically, his YouTube is called Dabu, DABOO77. And he does some pretty weird stuff, but periodically he keeps up with what's going on around the earth. So I believe it was on the, was it Bali or Malta? It was one of those islands. I forget which island. But anyway, all of a sudden the sea started to go up and down. This was not a tsunami. It was simply the ocean going up and down and up and down and up and down, and it crashed a whole bunch of boats on the rocks. And the scientists didn't know what to make of it. So they finally ended up in the you got to look this up, and you can look it up on Google or whatever. They finally just called it gravity waves. Now I'm 67 years old. I love the ocean. My dad owned a boat. It's like, I've never heard of gravity waves causing the ocean to go up and down and smash boats. Maybe you have, but I haven't. But it's like, what is a gravity wave, and when in the world has it ever occurred before that it just started smashing boats? And yet this happened. It's been videoed because obviously as it was going on, people got their cameras out and videoed this stuff. Did that make the first page of the paper? No. Did it make the last page of the paper? No. I wouldn't have known a thing about it if it wasn't for some of these alternative news sources. But the fact of the matter is, if you lived there and that was your boat and you were watching the ocean going up and down, smashing your boat, you would be like this thing it says, you'd be perplexed and anxious because of the roaring of the sea and of the waves. It's like, okay, that's what's going on. And it's still happening. And then it says, verse 26, people will be fainting from fear and from the expectation of the things that are coming on the inhabited world, for the powers of the heavens, and I believe that's demonic. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. And it's the demons. The Bible tells us very clearly in Revelation that when the devil knows that his time is short, he comes to earth and he causes trouble. And so we're going to expect this. And again, where does this leave you and I? Well, does it mean we're going through the tribulation? No, not yet. And I believe we're going to be raptured out beforehand. But what it does mean is that as we approach, it's not like everything's going to be wonderful and then there's going to be the rapture and everything's going to be horrible. When it comes to the stuff on the planet, there's going to be an increase. And we're in this period of increase. I firmly believe that, and people fainting from fear, and we see this. And then he talks about the coming of the Son of Man, and he tells the parable of the fig tree, and then I down to verse 34, and I think this verse 34 and following is really important for you and I. Verse 34, he says, "But watch yourselves, lest your heart be weighed down." Drunken hangovers, we're not going to have to worry about that. Drunkenness, we're not going to, but the cares of this life. And I know, like with these mass shootings, it just hurts my heart. People say, well, we could take away all the guns. No, we can't. I mean, come on. We tried to stop. We tried to take away heroin. We tried to take away meth. We tried to take away illegal drugs. It didn't do a thing. We're not going to be able to take away the guns from the evil people any more than we can take away meth or heroin or crack or anything like that. The things that are evil are going to make it. Besides the incident of evil, if you go back and you study the incident of evil, yeah, there weren't shootings before there were guns, but there were stabbings, there were clubbings, there were beatings. There were muggings. So, people are evil and people are going to do evil things. But what can happen is we can let ourselves get weighed down by the cares of this life. And we've got to be diligent in these times to read the Bible, fellowship with each other, talk positively, be like Gary Tyson and say, hey, it's all good. Let's look for the good in us. Let's see how we can use this for the forward movement of the kingdom. This stuff is going to happen. We're not going to be able to stop it. So what we've got to do is we've got to be able to figure out, okay, if I was Jesus, or I was one of the apostles living through this, how do I use this to forward the gospel? And then it says he was stay alert at all times, imploring God that you'll have the strength to escape all these things and to stand before the Son of Man. That, of course, is the judgment. And so that's Luke 21. And then you go into Luke 22. And this is the Feast of Unleavened Bread we call Passover. And he's talking about that. And Judas goes to betray him. And then starting at verse 7, you have the Last Supper. And then starting at verse 17, you institute the Lord's Supper. And then, which I think is funny, then in verse 24, the disciples start arguing about who's going to be the greatest, because Christ has been talking the end time, setting up his kingdom, that kind of thing. Who's greater? And then Peter's denial, and starting in verse 31, and then verse 35. And here's Christ, and he says to them, and remember, he's trying to prepare them because he knows he's leaving, and he knows they're going to be left on earth during the tribulation. So he's trying to prepare them. And he says, okay, when I sent you all out without a purse or a wallet or sandals, did you lack anything? And they said nothing. And this is important because when Christ sent them out early on in the ministry, if you remember, he sent them out 2 by 2, and he said, don't take an extra cloak, don't take sandals, don't take a purse. Go and preach the gospel and give what you have away. Freely you've received, freely give, and people will take care of you. And you know what? They did. Now, Christ says, now the time is changing. We're shifting from the acceptable year of the Lord to the day of vengeance of our God. He says in Matthew 24, the love of people is going to grow cold. People aren't going to accept the message of the gospel. People are going to consider godly people to be enemies. So he doesn't say, I'm going to send you out without a purse and without a coat. He's going to say instead, now you need to be prepared. And so he said in verse 36, but now he who has a purse, let him take it. What's he saying there in essence? He's saying, now you need to be prepared to take care of yourself. In an earlier time when people were more loving, were more kind, were more generous, were more open to the message of the gospel, I could send you out only to spread the gospel and people would take you in and take care of you, and they did. Now he's saying, now you're going to go out, things are different, times are different, people are different. You won't be just taken care of like that. You won't be loved simply because you're a believer. So he says, if you have a purse, take it. Make sure you're in a position to take care of yourself, that you could buy food, buy clothing. Likewise, his provision bag. You've got money and you've got your water bottle with you and you've got some snacks and other things that you might need. Maybe, a bedroll or whatever. And then this last part here, and let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. Now, he's going to be arrested later that night. I've talked to people that are pacifists, and they've said, well, yeah, he was talking about the fact that, that he needed some swords so that he could fulfill the prophecy that he was numbered with the transgressions. He'd already been sold out. Judas had already been to this is the Last Supper. A couple hours and he's going to be arrested. It's after dark. You're not going to be able to buy a sword somewhere after dark. When he says, if you don't have a sword, sell your coat and buy one, he's talking about in the days to come. And at the time of Christ, the sword was the apex weapon. That was, if you wanted to defend yourself in a hand-to-hand combat situation, the Roman gladius was the apex weapon. It was literally the sword that conquered the known world. And so when Christ said, he's at the Last Supper, and he said, if you don't have things are going to get very dicey. You don't know who's going to be, I remember, you guys might remember 2 years ago, Hurricane Irma hit South Florida. And Genevieve's half-brother, Bobby, decided to stay with his family. And later on, he said it was a terrible mistake. He made it through, thank God, and made it through okay. But he said his family was very frightened, and not by the hurricane. The hurricane had come and gone. But what happened is after the hurricane, there wasn't any gasoline, there wasn't any drinkable water, there wasn't any eatable food, there weren't any stores open. So you had gangs going from house to house, breaking down doors and going from house to house and harassing people and stealing food, taking what they wanted. And Bobby, who doesn't own a gun in the house, was pretty frightened that might happen, that he might get his front door kicked in by a bunch of ruffians. And that can happen just so quick. There can be an earthquake in your area, a tornado in your area, that kind of thing. And so what does Christ say? He says, look, have some money on hand, have some cash. Dave Ramsey, cash is king, and he's really true. Have some cash. You don't need to have $1 million in your house, but, have a couple $100 or something. So if things happen, you've got some cash there if the electricity is shut down. I know when Hurricane Hugo hit Charlotte, North Carolina, and my wife and I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, we were without power for 11 days. It wouldn't matter if we had a credit card. Nothing took them. Didn't matter if you had an ATM card. You couldn't get any money out. If you wanted anything, you had to have cash. And Hurricane Hugo wasn't supposed to hit Charlotte. The night before it hit, they came on the radio and said, yeah, we're going to get some pretty strong winds. If you got lawn chairs out, anything like that, you probably ought to fold them up. And then that night, Hurricane Hugo hit like a freight train. Absolutely unbelievable, the amount of damage from Hurricane. And what the night before, 6 hours before it hit, they thought it would be light, kind of medium to light breezes, put your lawn furniture away. So they don't really know. They can't predict, what can happen in your area. So what's Christ say? He says, look, things are going to get dicey, and they might get dicey in your area. And if they do, you want to have some money. You want to have some provisions. You want to have a way of defending yourself. And that's what Christ says to do. And then I think, then he goes on and of course, verse 38, they got the wrong idea. The poor disciples, they still didn't realize Christ was going to die yet. They didn't get the whole package. So they're like, look, we have 2 swords. And he says, enough of that. Wait, I wasn't talking about attacking the Romans tonight. Which is where the disciples would have gone with this. So they just misunderstood what he said, which I get, people can do that. And then you have the Last Supper. But we're going to have, while it comes to, there's a couple things on this list that aren't on this list that I think aren't on the list because of, it just wouldn't need to be spoken. One of them is have a community. The disciples, they were partners. They were partners before they met Christ in the fishing business. And they were partners throughout his ministry. If things were going to get dicey, they were going to stick together. It's a good time to meet your neighbors. Get to know who's on the house on the left, who's on the house on the right. If things get really dicey and you need, more than just the 2 of you or the 5 of you or whatever your family is. Another thing Christ didn't need to mention is walk in wisdom. It's like I live in a college town, and they've done, they set up, the police set up those things where they stop people and ask them questions and breathalyze them and stuff like this. And what they've determined is in the town in which I live, that if you're driving on a Friday night or a Saturday night after 10 o'clock at night, then 1 car out of 4 that passes you is somehow rather impaired. Either the guy has been up all night the night before studying and he's overtired, or they're bar hopping and they've had too much to drink, or they've, gotten into some kind of drug or something. But basically they can guarantee that pretty much 25% of the cars that are passing you on the road are impaired in some way. And so it's pretty simple. 10 o'clock rolls around and I figure out how to stay home. or if I've gone to visit somebody, I figure out how to stay at their house. But you walk in wisdom and you walk by the Spirit. And then that'll go the same for also our witnessing and our outreach. That we, Lord, here I am in whereverville, Starbucks, here I am on the street, here I am in the car place, here I am, how can I bring up the gospel? How can I make an impact? What can I say that will help this person become further along in a Christ journey, whether it's a Christ journey to get saved or a Christ journey to become like Christ if you are saved. And this is really, guys, we live in a great time. I mean, I think of in Top Gun, the guy was talking about all the enemy, and he said it's a target-rich environment. And we can look at it from the standpoint of, things are really tough and there's a lot of enemy. Or we can look at it, wow, we have the privilege of living in a really unique time in a target-rich environment. And we also have, for the ability to protect ourselves, get some extra food, have some food we could give away or help people out with, and certainly help ourselves with, and some provisions. If the power goes out, we can stay warm, we can have some light, that kind of thing. So this is Christ in Matthew 24, Luke 21, 22, and with the shootings that we've seen, this is a great time to really walk in wisdom and walk by the Spirit. And also have a ready word of comfort and blessing to help other people. So that's what I wanted to share tonight, and I sure appreciate your attention.